Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We have tonight Calvin Giordano, again joining us, Gianno Fioli, representing Calvin Giordano, to discuss the parking plan for the Ed Burke Park and Recreation Center. Earlier this year, the commission requested that we take a look at what options are available surrounding the park, to look into how many parking spaces we can create and what are the various different options to accommodate those parking spaces should we wish to move forward. Part of that will also be the discussion of what can be done around the park, different amenities or features that can be done. Tonight, Gianno is not able to join us in person. Earlier this week, he was in contact with somebody who tested positive, so he is self-quarantining, although he feels fine. So we thank him for being able to join us, Gianno, via Zoom. We also have Mayor O'Halpin here in person, Vice Mayor Kennedy, Commissioner Hammelberg, and Commissioner Gonzalez is with us via Zoom. We have a few residents here with us as well. And I know everybody here definitely knows the history of the park a lot better than I do, but for the sake of those watching online or those who may watch later, Biscayne Park years ago received state funding for improvements and amenities within the park. So the village is unable to now close that park to residents only, similar to a couple of parks that maybe Miami Shores might have and so forth. So it is open to everyone, and we do get plenty of visitors that come and enjoy that park. So the question is, that was posed, what are we going to do for to accommodate that, and how do we protect, how do we protect the landscaping and the trees surrounding the park? So that is something that we started looking at. Tonight's presentation by Gianno will essentially mainly be looking at how much parking can be accommodated, and then the three different options that he's looked into as to how to protect the routes and how to accommodate that parking spaces around. It is just for discussion purposes. There is no vote tonight. We'd love to hear some of your feedbacks, your thoughts on the presentation. With that, Gianno, if you'd like to share your screen and take it away.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect. Yes, good evening, and I do apologize that I cannot be there in person, as the manager said. I was exposed to COVID yesterday. So just out of caution, I just wanted to make sure that I was being precautious and respectful of everybody in the room. So I'm going to go ahead and share screens, and then we will go through the presentation. So this evening, we're looking at conceptual parking layouts for the park and the rec center, the entire city block. We're going to talk a little bit about what the project status is. We're going to share with you some conceptual parking layouts. We're going to talk about the different strategies and the research that we've done in order to be able to best protect the trees that are already existing. We're going to share with you some design vignettes just to give you a sense for what that could look like. And then we're going to give you some preliminary recommendations that we're putting forward simply to spark the conversation. So with that, I want to go ahead and do an introduction. I think everybody already knows who we are as Calvin Giordano Associates. We are a multidisciplinary firm, experienced in providing cross-discipline landscape architecture, engineering, and planning services. As the manager said, one of the things that we were charged with was to look and to study the opportunities to formalize the parking and increase opportunities to protect the existing trees. Right now, as it stands, you just have a swale and people park at their discretion. At times, the existing sidewalk that runs around the perimeter of the park is in conflict with some of those parking arrangements. So that then creates a situation where you compromise your ADA accessibility for the facility. Tonight's workshop is not a sort of decision-making workshop. Tonight's workshop is an informational workshop. Following this workshop, once we hear comments and feedback and discussion, then we will put together a schematic plan to take to commission for further discussion. And then we will put together revision and bring it back to commission for a final adoption. Some of the considerations that we took on from the onset when we started the project was making sure that we do not negatively impact the ADA parking that already exists. That ADA parking is there to serve the rec center building, and we want to make sure that we're not going to be impacting those. So we have excluded any improvements on the northwest corner of the block in front of the rec center, particularly because we don't want to impact that ADA condition. In addition to that, we took a careful dive into the Miami-Dade County Code. The moment that we formalize parking, we now need to meet code requirements. And the Miami-Dade County Code essentially has two stipulations that we need to meet. One is the minimum dimension of the parking spaces, which is stated as 8.5 feet by 18 feet deep. And depending on if you're parking at an angle or parking parallel or parking perpendicular, you have to have what's called a parking aisle, which is a clear space where a car can back out when they're exiting the parking space. So those were considerations that we had to take into account. And we have some solutions that we want to share with you. But I think the most critical of the conversations tonight is around trees and preservation of trees. I will say that we do not have the most ideal of situations because the trees are, they're large, they're pretty majestic, but because they are there, we have to make sure that that any kind of formalization of the parking is not going to negatively impact any of the existing tree roots. So what we've done in an effort to try to build a standard to apply to the park, we've identified two different zones. One we're calling the tree protection zone, which we're identifying as a 20-foot diameter. And then within that, we're identifying what we're calling a critical root zone at a 15-foot diameter. Now, a tree protection zone, best management practices requires or recommends that you have a 1-foot radius of tree protection zone per inch of DBH. That's per the inch of the diameter of the trunk of the tree. So a lot of these trees are pretty large. They exceed 20 inches. So if you have anything greater than a 20-inch diameter tree, then you have, from best management practices, you have a requirement to have a 40-foot diameter tree protection zone. Generally, you have that proportional relationship with the size of the tree, and you generally don't really take it beyond the drip line of the canopy. For the critical root zone, generally those areas are defined from a best management practices at a 50% of what that dimension of the tree protection zone is. So you identify the tree protection zone based on the size of the tree, and then half of that closest to the trunk, you absolutely try to not touch because those are the critical areas where the tree roots are. Now, we know and we acknowledge that having a 20-foot diameter tree protection zone around trees is a very aggressive stance. But when we look at the existing conditions, where you have trees generally spaced anywhere between 18 and 35 feet apart, mostly on the 30-foot on-center spacing, if we were to go with best management practices, then you essentially would have the entire swale of the majority of the perimeter of the park within a tree protection zone, and you wouldn't be able to do anything. So what we did is that we consulted with some of our certified arborists who have done work in park areas, roadway improvements, and they suggested that if we stay 10 to 15 feet away from the tree trunk, then that could be a reasonable accommodation that we could do. It's not ideal, but given the circumstances that we're facing, that would be acceptable. In addition to that, the perimeter walkway that goes around the park at times is 15, 20 feet away from the edge of the asphalt of the roadway, and at times is 10 feet away. So in order to be able to accommodate parking, the location and the alignment of that walkway will need to shift depending on the parking strategy and the parking arrangement that we're looking for. So let me share with you some conceptual parking layouts, talking about all the parking around the entire rec center and the park area. When we look at all four sides of the park, no four sides are the same. In fact, you have variations along each frontage. At times you have swales that are being used for parallel parking. At times you have formalized perpendicular parking. And what we're trying to do is that we're trying to, being conscientious of the economics of it, we're also trying to keep as much of what you already have formally, and then looking to see where can we augment the opportunities to maximize the parking. So as we looked and did some analysis, we recognized that there are issues with the swales being overshaded, which means the sod will never grow there. And whatever we plant needs to be shade loving. We recognize that there's conflicts with the trees right now because there are no tree guards. We have observed people parking as close as a foot away from a tree trunk, which is extremely undesirable because as the cars park in those areas, what they're doing is that they're further compacting the soil. And that compaction of the soil above, particularly the critical root area, that can start to choke the trees out. I'm going to share with you 4 different parking concepts, ranging from different strategies, looking at angled parking, looking at perpendicular parking. And what we were able to find is that at a minimum, we were able to maximize 51 parking spaces. Minimize 51 parking spaces, and at its maximum, we could get as much as 64. So I think that part of this also needs to be some feedback from you as to what is an acceptable carrying capacity that you want to have for your parking. Do you want to maximize all the opportunities for parking because you have that much demand? Or is there an opportunity to pick and choose where we want to put the parking so that maybe the parking target numbers are not as high? So I'm going to briefly go through these diagrams, and then we're going to get into the vignettes to talk with some more detail. The first concept, we were able to achieve 53 parking spaces. The areas outlined in red were angled parking along Northeast 9th and Northeast 9th Avenue or Northeast 9th Court, and then along Northeast 113th and 115th, those are perpendicular parking. And the one at the northwest corner at 9th Avenue and 15th Street already exists in that configuration, and we thought that it would be best to leave it in that way. We then looked at, well, what happens if we only do 45-degree drive-in parking? And that gave us a total of 52 parking spaces. Just as a reminder, the numbers, the circles that you see on the plan, the red circles are the critical root areas, and the orange circles are, or those yellow sort of boundary circles are what we're calling the remnant of the tree protection zone. But with this one, we were able to get 52 parking spaces, all with drive-in angled parking. And then we looked at what were the parking counts that we could achieve only doing parallel parking, parallel to the travel lane. And those gave us a total of 51 parking spaces. This is probably the least invasive of the strategies, but they gave us some similar numbers. So what we did was that we looked at a combination and a hybrid of each of them, so that the areas shown in blue would all be parallel parking, because that would provide the least amount of impact on the existing sidewalks. The areas in purple would be angled back in parking, particularly because Northeast 9th Court is a one-way and is a very narrow travel lane. So if we were going to do drive-in parking on Northeast 9th Court, then we would essentially have to push the parking in further into the park in order to be able to meet the aisle requirements that the county code has in place. And then the ones in red are the areas that we thought could accommodate perpendicular parking. So 90-degree pull-in parking, typical like what you see in sort of a parking lot. We then looked at, all right, now that we've sort of quantified what the maximum number of parking could be accommodated, which is at 64 parking spaces. And this is in addition to whatever already exists in front of the rec center. Remember, we're not touching the ADA parking that already exists in front of the rec center. We then started to look at, all right, well, how can we best protect the trees? And what can we do around the trees in order to minimize any kind of impact? It would be unrealistic for me to commit to you that any construction would not provide an impact to the trees. They all will. The effort here is trying to minimize what that impact could be. Another thing that is really critical to consider is the fact that all of your swales are drainage swales. So we cannot pave over your swales, because then we may potentially cause a drainage issue and a flooding issue in the village. So we 100% can only look at trying to increase some level of formalization for the parking while keeping some degree of perviousness so that the water can still percolate and still drain in the natural form that it currently does. Generally, there's three different strategies that can be used. The first one on the far left is the use of structural soils. Structural soils is a mixture of planting medium with aggregate. And the aggregate, the rock that you see, essentially creates a scaffolding where the planting soil sort of fills in the gaps in between, and the tree roots can move, grow, and you can get enough areas for percolation for soil. That is not a cheap solution, but is not as expensive as the other two. The other two provide, the one in the middle, the pavement suspension system, is the one that provides the greatest amount of protection to the existing trees, but it is cost prohibitive. Particularly because essentially what you're doing is that you are creating a series of pilings in a grid format, which is what you see in orange, and you're driving pilings down into the ground to then create a suspension system for a sort of paved area that essentially floats over the existing tree roots. So imagine a wedding cake and sticking a bunch of sticks into the wedding cake and then putting a new layer on top. The sticks are going to provide the structure, but you still have the medium within which the tree roots can go probably about an 80 or 70% without impact. But again, that is very expensive. That requires geotechnical engineering. It provides an extensive amount of pilings. You also have to pour the concrete. And once you have a failure in the system, then you have to go back and sort of redo and excavate out that portion or redo that portion of the system. So it can be pretty costly. The one on the far right is kind of becoming the gold standard for urban tree plantings within areas where tree roots need to coexist with improvements. And those are soil cell systems, but that is best done when you're first planting the tree. And essentially what it is those black boxes that look like egg crates are almost like Lego pieces. And you build the Lego pieces around the area where the tree roots will eventually grow. There have been situations where these have been installed and erected around existing tree roots, but that requires an extensive amount of work. You essentially have to create a huge pit around the existing tree, and you basically have to comb all the roots into the system and erect the system around the tree roots, and then backfill it with planting soil. Both the pavement suspension system and the soil cell suspension system, even though they look fragile, they were designed to be able to carry roadway type of loads in the form of trucks and fire trucks and the like. And they can be engineered to be able to carry that kind of weight. We then looked at surfacing and what kind of surfacing we could look at that would still provide some level of perviousness. The first one is Pervious Asphalt. It's something that we're pretty familiar with. It allows for an incredible amount of degree of water infiltration, which is desirable for us, again, because the swales are all functioning as your passive drainage. In the center, there's the paver block. And when you look at the paver block on the internet, they always show you images of the paver block where the cells are filled with grass, and it looks really beautiful. However, in the circumstances that we are in, one, we're overshaded, so grass is not going to grow in those areas. And two, we just don't have the type of grass species that will do well in those cells. Our grasses are rhizomatic, so they need to be interconnected. They cannot survive in these tiny little cells because they get choked out. And the last on the far right are pervious pavers, which we've done. We've successfully installed several acres of pervious pavers in parking lots that we've done as far north of Delray. And that requires some level of excavation that could potentially impact the tree roots as well. Now, there are all pros and cons to each one of these different surfaces. For the asphalt, it can be done with some minimal excavation. It is going to require a subbase. Again, that depth is going to have to be dependent on a geotechnical analysis of the soil to find out what its compressive value is. But the great thing about the porous asphalt is that if there is any settlement, you can always come back and patch it, which is something that you cannot do with the other finishes. It can be easily striped, so you can easily get the designation for the different parking aisles. And the only maintenance that you really have to do is any patching for any settlement, and periodically you need to come in and vacuum it so that if there's any dust or settlement or dirt in the asphalt, you can suction those out so that then you can maintain as much of its performative quality as possible. The paver blocks, as I said, are going to require much more excavation. If there is a settlement, you have to remove the system, restore the subbase, and then put back the paver block. In order to be able to install it, you will probably have to do some level of compaction that may negatively impact the trees as well. And the maintenance there has to be routine, not periodic. You need to refill the cells with gravel, and you have to do extensive periodic weed control. I'll tell you anecdotally, on the street where I live, in Miami, the city of Miami installed these paver blocks on the on all the swales. And where there is no consistent vehicular parking, there is a tremendous amount of weed issues that need to be resolved. So that's a maintenance issue that I think we need to be cognizant of as we make these different selections. And the last option with regards to the pervious pavers is that similar to the paver block, this is also going to require some base treatment, some capacity for rock underneath the paver areas. And if there's settlement that happens again here, then you also need to remove the pavers, remove the system, do the compaction, and reinstall the system. It becomes expensive to maintain. And it's very difficult to be able to stripe these so that you can have that designated parking lanes in the way that you want. Because the perviousness is achieved through gaps in between the pavers, you really don't have that much of a weed problem, but you do have a washout of some of the sand that gets filled in. So that periodically needs to be refilled, maybe once a year. So let's look at—
Sorry, Gianna, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
Can you go back a slide? On the far right, on pervious pavers, you said that they cannot be easily striped, but your slide says that they can.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's a typo. It
cannot be easily striped.
It cannot be easily striped because of the perviousness and the gap in between the pavers. Then the striping gets interrupted. It just doesn't look very clean. So let's look at some of these scenarios so that we can get a sense for what they will look like. With regards to 90-degree parking, when we look at the existing conditions, this is there's generally two conditions that we find. One where the sidewalk is pretty close to the edge of the travel lane, and one where it's separate. In that condition, when we look at asphalt 90-degree parking over Silvacell, we see that gives you a pretty clean look, very typical to the kinds of looks that we're accustomed to. And then the only thing that really changes is that finish on the top, because the system underground is not one that's visible. So this is what it will look like with pavers, and this one with the paver block. Again, it's not going to have that sort of stippling of the green in the way that it's shown in the rendering. We had to put that in here just so that it could be legible, but a reminder that because there's so much shade, the grass is just not going to grow. You're going to end up with gravel there. When we change the system from Silvacells to structural soils, the look is exactly the same, but the performance is different. So when we look at them for the asphalt, for the pavers, and for the paver block, it essentially looks the same. It just performs differently because of what's underground. When we look at the 45-degree parking, we try to mimic some of the parking situations that we actually found when we went out there. We think that gives you a nice clean look. It will provide those gaps in between where you can provide some landscape that bring that landscape up until the edge of the roadway, which could be pretty attractive. It gives us an opportunity to sort of beautify that edge a little bit more. And you'll see what it'll look like with the asphalt and with the pavers, as well as with the paver block. And you'll notice that with the paver block, it reads more like a mono surface with no parking lane designation. Similar to how we changed the substrate for the structural soils, for the pavers, and the paver blocks. Particularly on 9th Court, this is where we looked at the back end parking in order to not negatively impact that travel lane. So we have what it'll look like with the asphalt, the pavers, and the paver blocks. Similarly, with the structural soils, as I said, the surface treatment is the thing that you look at. So you really don't see what's going on underground. And then finally, the parallel parking, what that experience will look like. Essentially, what the parallel parking does is that it makes the travel lanes feel wider because you're essentially adding more asphalt closest to the edge of the travel lane. What that does too is that gives us an opportunity to create a bit of a buffer and a landscape edge between the perimeter walkway and the parking that could be there. So a view of what that looks like with the asphalt, with the pavers, and with the paver blocks, similarly with the structural soils. So I think that the thing to stress here is that what we do underground to accommodate for drainage really has no bearing on what the finish is. We just need to pick the right finish to make sure that we're not negatively impacting the overall area. So in terms of recommendations, we are recommending that if the desire is to maximize parking, that we go with that hybrid strategy where we mix perpendicular, angled, and parallel parking in order to maximize the opportunities to add those 64 spaces. With regards to a finish, we would recommend that we use structural soils as our subbase, and as a finish that we use the porous asphalt, because of all the different options, this is the most cost efficient and the one that's easiest to maintain. And just a look of what that will look like, given the different parking arrangements. And then I think that just to be overly cautious, which I think the fact that these mature trees exist, it merits being overly cautious. Some of the recommendations that I think we're going to be looking at as we put together specs for this schematic plan is to clearly spell out tree protection strategies that need to be implemented during construction. City of Miami Beach has a great detail that is where they use a chain link fence so that way nobody can mistakenly back up into a tree and damage a tree trunk or a tree root. We're also going to have to require that the contractor has extensive experience performing tree work. So in the qualifications of whoever is going to be bidding on this project, when that gets put out, we need to make sure, and we'll work with staff to make sure that that language is there, that the right contractor with the right experience and the right team is doing the work. You don't want your daily run-of-the-mill landscape maintenance folks doing this. You have precious trees that need to be protected, and that's going to require an additional cost and additional investment. But if we don't do that, then we run the risk of potentially creating a slow death on those trees by choking them in a slow manner. We're also going to have to require that the presence, not just the inclusion of an ISA certified arborist, but the presence of an ISA certified arborist occurs on site every time they're doing any kind of root pruning or anytime they're doing any kind of excavation that may impact any tree roots. That's going to be critical because then the arborist needs to direct the excavation team to make sure that they're doing things that are consistent with ISA standards and best management practices that can best protect those trees. We are going to put some recommendations in there to require a minimum 90-day root pruning period. Generally, we do 45 days, but because these trees are mature and large, we want to double that as a minimum. So that way you have a 90-day root pruning period with a watering truck contract to make sure that those trees are properly irrigated so that they do not go into shock. And that's going to be really important. If there's going to be a need for any tree root work, we're going to require that the arborist uses an air spade, which is essentially like a pressurized air blower that basically helps them excavate the areas around the tree roots without the use of heavy equipment. And it gives them more surgical precision so that they don't negatively impact those tree roots. And then we would require or recommend that there's a requirement for a 2-year period of an arborist-directed tree care once the construction is completed to ensure that there's better survivability of those trees, making sure that an arborist is coming and making some evaluations of those trees to make sure that there's no evidence of potential dieback, potential shock, or any negative impact. So just as a reminder, if anybody joined late, this is not a decision-making meeting. This is a feedback meeting. We're simply just having a dialogue about what the opportunities are. Once we have the sort of parking arrangement and those parking thresholds identified, we will look to opportunities to maximize the perimeter walkway around the park to provide some passive programming in the form potentially of exercise stations, seating, and the creation of moments where some of these uses could actually happen. And then, of course, we would look at a furniture palette. I still need to hear, and I'm very interested in hearing from the commission and from the community what kind of aesthetic you're looking for. When we did a presentation recently for the improvements outside of the log cabin, the feedback that we got was that there was a desire to honor and stay true to the aesthetic and the historical character of the log cabin. I'm interested in hearing what the desires of the aesthetic is for this area. Do you want something that feels more contemporary and more modern and more up to date, or do you want to carry that aesthetic that will be done at the log cabin here as well? And with that, I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I'm very interested in hearing all the feedback that everybody has.
Thank you, Giano. And just a reminder, this is when we first started looking at the project, and the commission asked for Calvin Giordano to look at the park and what options are available. We always anticipated this might be a multi-year type of project when it comes down to costs and what's available. So what we're trying to do is organize what the plan would be, what that end result would be, and then we would go back and see how we can break it up into various different phases so that we would be able to break it out into smaller projects that would be affordable over some time. Ideally, it's always best to just rip the Band-Aid off, do it once and we're done. But we do have plenty of constraints when it comes to budgetary concerns. So we would have to kind of plan out how that would work over the next several years. With that, I'd like to open up the floor for comments and questions. I don't know if the commission would like to hear from the public first, or if you all would like to say a few questions first. Is there anybody here in the log cabin that would like to mention anything, recommend, discuss anything that was presented? Please feel free to go up to the microphone. I did turn it on earlier, but they have a tendency to shut off when they're not being used. So, yep. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Dan Keys. I did not see a consideration of angle parking on 9th Court utilizing one of the two lanes that are existing on 9th Court. 9th Court's a one-way road. We really only need one lane of travel. We could use an entire half the road to produce quite a bit of parking. Staying away from the trees, it's kind of a win-win all the way around. Also, there are time periods of intensive potential extensive use, and there are every other day of the year. You know, you have an art festival, you have sports activities in the future. That's one thing, but everyday use, I wonder if a survey has been made over a period of time to see how many vehicles are actually parked there and where they're parked. There's just cursory observation is, you know, there's a lot of activity and need for parking near the basketball court. The other side on 9th Avenue, excuse me, on 9th Court, there's the existing parking there that seems to be full most of the time. Further down on 9th Court, 3 or 4 cars parked there on a reasonably busy day. And then you have people on the 9th Avenue side closer to 113th Street that come and park in the shade and eat their lunch on some sort of basis. You know, so I'm sort of arguing for less developed parking, and then some treatment of the swale that deals with the fact that we can't grow grass in the shade and so forth. And provide somewhat of a more aesthetic appearance to those locations that would be used infrequently. Currently, as we have, based on what's established as a recreational program in Biscayne Park today. We most definitely have had very intensive uses with football, soccer, and baseball in the history of this community. That might come back someday. Actually, when I drove by today, there was probably 35, 40 cars around the perimeter because we have some sort of soccer program going on there now. I don't know what that means, Mac. Oh, okay, 53 cars. You know, but that's on a very sporadic basis. Okay. And I do appreciate the extensive consideration for the trees that are there. Know a little bit about trees and root damage and non-root damage produced by vehicle. You know, that's definitely a factor of frequency. And currently we don't have the frequency on much of the open swale area that it is a concern to me as somebody who knows something about trees. Plain and simple. You look at the trees, and right now, there's not a problem with the trees. They're not dying back. Been there for a long time. We're going to do a lot more damage, even under the best circumstances, to the trees by developing parking. And that might be necessary in a few places. But, you know, I would argue for a swale surface that isn't designated as parking, but that people are that people might park on at some point in time. And as long as that can be kept safe as a walking surface, we never have had a problem with a car falling into a big hole, a sinkhole on the right of way around the park. I don't think that's going to happen. And we, you know, recognize that and don't jump at the opportunity either today or in the future to really develop an awful lot of parking that's going to sit there 364 days of the year unused. You know, I honestly would like to shut up now, but possibly talk later. So hopefully you'll give me that opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Gary Kuehl, 111th Street. Kind of piggyback on what Dan said. It seems to me that if on 9th Avenue, you did the same thing that you might do on 9th Court, where you went with angled parking and narrowed the drive lane, making 9th Avenue one way like 9th Court, that you might be able to accommodate more parking further away from the trees and make it more convenient. And it may be at the sacrifice of the current location of the handicap parking by moving that out. But I think, you know, that's almost inconsequential because there's only a couple of spaces. I think the next question is too, that once you create more designated parking, I don't know, forgotten the ratio, but I think it might increase the number of handicap spaces that you need to have. I do agree with the pervious asphalt. I think the other two options, aside from being expensive, have a number of problems. Turf block, by the way, is not that stable, and large trucks will break it, and we do have that. I think also the idea of making 9th Court and 9th Avenue one way, it might reinforce the idea, at least on 9th Court right now, where occasionally people do go the wrong way. which is really a problem. So I think if you were to narrow that lane, it might amplify the fact that it is a one-way street. Other than that, I appreciate the presentation. I sincerely appreciate the attention to the trees. I think that's extremely important because currently they are being abused. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could comment really quickly, the reduction of the travel lanes down to a one-way may trigger a requirement from the county to do a traffic study in order to change that direction. We'd have to check to see if that's what that requirement would be. The one thing that I think is very critical is that the fire department is going to require that any one-way street has a minimum clear width of 16 to 17 feet. So that way, if a vehicle is stalled on the travel lane, then there's enough asphalt area for a fire truck to get around. The way that we've done it in other municipalities is that whenever we do the one-way, we minimize the designation of the travel lane down to 10 feet to do some traffic calming and slow down the cars. And then the remnants of that requirement of asphalt area, we stripe it as a bike lane. So that way we have that improvement as well, that then still meets the fire department's requirements and then provides an increased amenity for the community.
I forgot one comment. Back-end parking, I don't think is an option. I think that's just far too difficult for most people.
Barbara Kuehl. I agree with Dan Key's comments and Gary's, and especially about the back end parking. I was, right before we came here, I was looking this up online because I know in a lot of municipal parking lots, it's illegal to back in. And I really think for the amount of, just like Dan said, we don't really have this great need for a lot of spaces. Once in a while we have something, and I've lived here 40 years. I've never had a problem. I've never had to go home because I couldn't park someplace. So somehow we manage, and even if we have to park on somebody's swale for the day, you know, it's fine. When I was reading the plans, it said something about, I thought it said something about sidewalk relocation. Is that part of this? Because you didn't mention anything about the sidewalk moving.
Yes, so in one of the slides earlier on, I talked about depending on what parking arrangement we choose, it may impact the existing alignment of where that sidewalk is. We may have to push that sidewalk further into the park, depending on if you want parallel, angled, or perpendicular parking. But that will be on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the final arrangement is. I think that one of the things that we need to, that I would like to get some clarity on, is as a village, what is that critical carrying capacity that you want? What's that parking number that you want me to target? I was able to maximize it at 64, but if I'm hearing that the 64 is too much, then what is the number? Knowing that we can get as much as 64, I'd like to be able to cut back that, because then it gives us some opportunities to minimize cost, minimize impact to trees, so on and so forth.
I'm mostly concerned with 9th Court because it seems like that's the best parking potential. And to get angle parking, would you have to move the sidewalk?
On 9th Court, we will, because the sidewalk is pretty close to the edge of the travel lane. You essentially have enough space for parallel parking there. So if we are going to do angled parking, then that sidewalk needs to, and let me share my screen really quickly. I have the aerial, the street view of 9th Court. So this is 9th Court. If we are going to put angled parking, then we would need to shift that sidewalk to the other side of the trees. So that's why I said, depending on the arrangement that we want, then that may trigger the need to do some realignment. of
Okay,
that.
so when I saw that on your, when I was looking at home, uh, what about the impact of the sidewalk on the trees?
Well, the impact of the sidewalk on the trees wouldn't be as extensive as the swale parking. Because in order to provide the swale parking and maximize the parking, we're essentially paving the entire area around the tree. Here, we're only doing one side of the tree. We'll have to do some minimal sort of root pruning on that side.
I see
But
a
those
couple
areas,
of, I see a couple of people shaking their heads in the audience that seem to also know what they're talking about.
yeah.
It's
The
okay.
as I said earlier, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. There will be impact to trees. It's simply just a matter of selecting the option that provides the least amount of impact. But it's every improvement that you're doing is going to impact the trees because the trees are large. They have large root balls.
If
And
you
we
look
simply
at,
ju-
if you look at Ninth Court, is there any way of reducing the width of the road? Not just enough to do the standards with the fire trucks, but not to have to move the sidewalk? Can you take half a lane? And will that give you enough space to do angle parking and be able to leave the sidewalk where it is?
We'd have to check those dimensions. But my recollection is that that has just enough to meet the fire department's standards. So we'll take a second look at that and see if that's an option that we can look at. It sounds like there's an appetite to potentially reduce the travel lane as much as possible and sort of reallocate that to the parking.
Okay, and the other thing with like back end parking, I can't imagine going down the road with a car behind me and then having to stop and try to back into a space when somebody's right on my tail. I mean, it just seems like that part they don't mention. Not to mention people navigating that don't have cameras in their car, trying to take the time to align themselves in a parking space. So I think for our community, I would prefer head-in parking, if angle parking.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And Gianno, can you, before we go on to some of the questions on Zoom, can you address when you were out at the park, your observation? Did you do any counts or anything like that? Like, what was it that you saw, and what was the process that you took? I know we didn't do a formal survey for how many cars were parked on a daily basis, but can you dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I was out there. I probably visited the park about 6 or 7 times at different times of the day. And every time I went there, I only saw a handful of cars, generally in the vicinity of like 15 to 20. I never really saw the swales at capacity. But I did not do a formal survey of parking counts on a per road basis. If that's something that we want to do, then we have to schedule it and plan it, because I think that we'd have to do it at different times of the day and different days of the week so that we can get and capture as much of a realistic picture of what the demand is.
Thank you. With that, we will go to, I'm sorry. We have one more comment here in-house, and then we'll go to Janie Anderson, who's waiting on Zoom.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I jumped the gun a little. Gage Hartung, 114th Street. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's really good. My comments would just be a couple things. Is just whatever surface we select would be as non-maintenance as possible. So obviously 10 years from now, the roots and all that, we can get back right to where we were at with sidewalks, lifting and things like that, so that'd be consideration. The parking, I think that, maybe a traffic study or something could be useful as far as just what are the peak times, what is the average number of people that use the park, and how many cars a day. So maybe a study of some sort could be helpful. And then as far as using up some of the existing road around it, I just want to keep in mind that there are people that live on the other side of the road. So, we might be infringing on their quality of life, having cars parked, within the full-size street that's in front of them currently. So just keep that in mind.
It also helps them on their parking a little bit when they got formal parking there.
Yeah, I mean, we have people over here that park here at night that don't have driveways in their front yard. That's another story. Parking. Oh, and then if we're gonna get into like other uses of the park, like those sports machines, I would like to say, hopefully we have another workshop on things like that, that I know this is just as parking. Personally, those little stations kind of scare me a little bit as far as visual blight goes. So, but I would wait to hear a presentation on that specifically. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On Zoom, we have Janie Anderson.
Thank you so much, Jamie Anderson, 11th Place and 119th Street. The first thing, I just want to thank every one of you, the commission, Mario, the planners, for finally getting this conversation going. It is so long overdue. It has so been the can that got kicked down the road. Thank you. Let's just move forward with it, though, and not do what we have a bad history of doing. Now, as far as scaling back the parking, I think a parking survey is absolutely critical. Yes, it's going to vary. I understand that. But we have all too many times, late afternoon, weekends, and certainly our various community events, which now are starting up again, where significant amounts of cars are there. And if we don't provide adequate parking, we're just right back where we started from. We're right back, quite honestly, with parking areas that don't conform to our code, the code that we're now making residents conform to, proper parking spaces, not torn up gravel pits. So if we're going to do this again, yes, I understand not wanting to go overboard, and the fewer spaces we need, perhaps the better quality product you have, that's great, but let's just do it correctly. Also, as far as one-waying 9th Ave, that was discussed years ago. That was supposed to have been done not that long after 9th Court. So that was another one of the can that kept getting kicked down the road thing. I just hope things will go better from here out. You know, this is supposed to be our crown jewel. This is our central park. So we need to devote the proper attention and money to it. Thanks.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Bob Anderson. I'm sorry, Bob, you have some kind of filter. You have some kind of filter that's making your voice sound like Mickey. Hold on. Sorry, Bob, you have a filter on that makes your voice sound like a Mickey Mouse. If you can just go back to Janie's. All right, there he is.
Each time there's updates that come into my Windows computer and it does all kinds of weird stuff to it. But I'm sorry about that. Okay, what I like, is a presentation as far as parking surfaces. And I always thought, have a turf block would be the ideal thing, but my mind's changed now. And I like that pervious asphalt and the explanation that it needs to be vacuumed every once in a while so it doesn't, so it stays pervious. I like the thought on that one. And actually, the number of parking spaces, all we need to do is to take a look of all the worn, really rutted areas around the park. And it's not completely all the way around, but the ones that are well used, obviously, that's where you need to have some parking spaces. And so I don't think, we need to have them a high number, but we do definitely need to have, when activities are going on out in the field, obviously people are going to be parking by 113th and on 9th. And then you will always have some kind of an activity going on where the basketball court area is. So, definitely need to have, some definite parking there. And then I like where it was brought up about doing the one way. Years ago, 9th was two-way. And that street is a very narrow street. And for people that were parking at the rec center, it was pretty tough. You know, it was very dangerous to try to get out, and cars coming right by the edges of the cars. So yes, the city had to work with the county to get approval and surveys done to go ahead and have that one way. And the concept is once that was done for a couple of years of usage, was to go back to the county to ask on the opposite side of the park over there on 9th to do it one way there too. So one side of the park is going like it is now, it's going south. The other side was going to be one way going north. But evidently with different leadership changes in our commission, they didn't think it was all that important and it never happened. But the thought was there. This is going back a lot of years ago. So I hope we can bring that back up again and having it one way on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other residents on Zoom that would like to comment, ask a question? Okay, with that, we'll get started with commission questions and comments. If you don't mind, I'd like to, since we're still on the Zoom platform, I'd like to ask Commissioner Gonzalez, he did have his hand up. If you can maybe just start us off.
Good evening, everybody. How are you? So I don't know, most of you may or may not know that I've been in the parking business for over 30 years. I've been involved in all sorts of parking designs and parking, everything that has to do with parking. So the first thing that you need to do in a parking situation is figure out your need, right? So a parking study is crucial. And then you have to plan for your average. You can't plan for your peaks and you can't plan for your lows. You have to plan for your average. So if, whatever our average is that's what we have to plan. I think that's really important. I didn't see a parking study part of this presentation, and I think that's crucial so that we understand what our actual parking needs are. Once we have that determined, then we can talk about what we need as far as spaces is concerned and whatnot and all of that. But until we have that data, I think that it's hard to determine what exactly we will need to plan as far as what we'll need to do with the park. So until I see a plan, a parking study, I'm not going to have a lot of input into this conversation. So that's pretty much all I got, guys, for now.
Thank you. Does anybody on the dais wish to start off the conversation?
Yeah, Commissioner Hammelberg. I do recall several years ago when they talked about making several streets in the park one-ways. I believe they were talking about it to make some bicycle lanes, but the residents on the streets were pretty vehement about not wanting one-ways. So I think we need to get feedback from the residents. When we did 9th Court, the residents on 9th Court were all in for a one-way because they were tired of the traffic being so bad on their street with the park and the kids running around. So they were very happy for it. So I think we need to make sure that the people on 9th Avenue are included in the decision-making, as well as the traffic flow study and the parking studies.
Thank you, and we can definitely do that and get a survey from the residents around there once we go into that direction and working with the county. Vice Mayor Kennedy, would you like to go next?
Sure. So first, Gianna, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot looking at it at home over the weekend. And then again, tonight, you answered a lot of my questions that I had written down here. But I do have a couple of other things I want to ask you. So in terms of having some kind of a survey and knowing, and Art, I appreciate hearing you say how parking professionals consider an average, not peak highs and lows. That was interesting to hear as well. But I also would like to see some numbers behind it. We all go past the rec center when there's nobody there, right? Except for some people who live along there who make it their parking. But then there are times when we see it completely jam-packed. Like tonight on my way here, there were 53 cars there. I drove around, 53 cars, a lot of them parked, certainly places where we wouldn't want them to be parked. And there's not a special event going on there tonight. There just happened to be a lot of people out there doing things at the rec center tonight. So there's some people playing games and, yeah. So, but it wasn't any kind of a special event. So that was interesting to see that this evening there were 53 cars there, but I walk a lot in the village. I walk many days a week and there are times that I walk by, there's a lot of cars. But other questions for you, Gianno. Right now, how many actual parking spaces do we have? Like that, you use the word formalized. So how many formal parking spaces do we have right now?
I honestly couldn't answer that question, only because the parking right now is so haphazard. You only have those.
I guess they're only the ones there by the tot lot. Those are the only actual like legal parking spaces, right?
Correct. The ones on the northwest corner. And if my memory serves me correct, you have somewhere in the vicinity of about 8 to 10 parking spaces there. I can check really quick.
I thought it was 6, but okay. Northeast, not northwest. It's by the tot lot. At any rate, okay, so it's 10-ish, we'll say.
Yeah.
And then how many informal spaces do we have? Because you're using the word formalized, because there are places that cars park all the time. So just kind of get a handle on how many sort of parking spaces we have overall right now.
I mean, I'm thinking, again, there's been times that I've been there that cars are parked and they're overhanging over the sidewalk in areas that are not designed to be parking. So when everybody makes any opportunity to park, it's hard to come up with an actual number. But generally, I would say that if I were to quantify it, you probably would get somewhere in the 50s, mid 50s of opportunities for pull-in perpendicular parking.
Okay.
But again, these are in conflict a lot of times with the existing sidewalk.
Okay. If we were to decide, and we're not deciding anything now, so this is a beginning of a conversation that we want to have. If we were decide to move forward with this, and we also were to consider the possibility of some other things that were listed in our in our discussion item from several months ago, things like benches and lighting and water stations and all the other things that we kind of list. I listed them there kind of randomly, and we didn't decide on anything officially. At what point would we have to decide which of those elements we move forward with to determine how they would impact the work that would be required on the parking? In other words, we don't want to do any work and then go back and have to undo things or not be able to do things because we didn't plan ahead. So would we have to decide on all of those things around the outside of the park so we don't make double work? Or
no, I think that the only whatever infrastructure you would need in order, like if you want to do drinking fountains, bottle fillers, lighting, and you don't have the money to do that at the onset, what we would do is that we would sleeve it and put all the conduits in place so that when you're ready, it's just plug and play.
Okay, so we would, assuming we'd want to include some other things, we should have an idea what those things might be so we can do what you just described.
Correct. And if the appetite is to maximize parking, then all those amenities would happen on the interior side of the sidewalk.
Right. So everything would stay inside and this would all be outside.
Correct. If you're not looking to maximize parking, then there's opportunities to put them on the roadway side of the sidewalk in between some of those parking groupings.
Okay. Can you educate us a little bit on ADA a bit more? We have Judy here on the commission and she's a bit of an expert on that, but I think I would like to hear this coming from you guys as well. So you said something about, and I wrote this down, about existing parking is impacting ADA access.
Right.
We only have ADA in that one location. So
you have ADA parking right now on the east facade of the rec center.
Right.
that is the only place that you're really required to have parking because you have
Okay.
an interior habitable use.
Okay, so that was
Um,
my big question. Is there any other requirement for it other than in that one place for access to the building?
No, we've looked at standards. We've done parks where we've looked to see what the minimum requirements are
Mhm.
for ADA parking, and specifically for parks and open space. There's no real requirement. It really is driven by what kind of programming you have in there. So when you have a large, open, flexible space that doesn't have a clearly designated program, it's hard to determine what the minimum requirement is. It's really driven more by use and demand.
Okay, so
when
if
I
there's, go ahead.
no, when I mentioned about the impact to ADA was when I observed cars parked overhanging over the sidewalk,
Mhm.
impeding
I
the
see.
ability
Okay.
for people to walk and utilize it.
Got it. Okay, so that's what you were referring to, because we do have that problem of cars sticking out over the sidewalk.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
now I understand what you were talking about there. So what I'm hearing you say is we're required to have ADA where we have it because of access to the building, but you're not required to have it elsewhere. Now, beyond what's required, what is the sort of like best practices if you want to be a community that is welcoming to people who need ADA parking and want to access the field, the basketball court? I mean, sort of what is the best thing to do if you want to be more welcoming?
So the standard that we typically apply is that whenever you have a heavily programmed outdoor space that is sort of a flexible use,
Mhm.
on a per quarter acre basis, we typically do one parking space per quarter acre. Now, if you have a children's playground, then that would merit having maybe 2 or 3 parking spaces that are ADA compliant. Again, it's really driven by the program that you're having and making sure that those parking spaces are as close to those destinations and those uses as possible, so that if you have a disabled person that wants to park and goes to the amenities, that those can be applied.
Okay, understood. So there's what's required, and then you can do more if you just want to give people more access. I think Judy wants to say something about this.
Yeah, we do have residents who are wheelchair bound, as well as residents who walk with walkers, but we have some young residents who are wheelchair bound.
Mhm.
And we've got a young man who walks with a prosthetic leg, and we've got a few older people with those similar problems. So to me, we need to have access for them to get their wheelchairs in and out. So rather than a total number of non-handicap access, I think we need to include handicap access in our plans for the people.
The best way to do it is to not group all of your handicap parking spaces in just one location, but to sort of pepper them throughout, because that builds as much equity as possible in the design, so that people of different levels of ability can still have access to the different areas within the park. So if that's something that the commission desires for us to explore, then that's the recommendation that I would put forward.
Well, clearly, we're not doing that tonight, but that's what I wanted to hear from you, because it's not a matter, it's certainly a matter of what's required. We have to do what's required, but a matter of what's the best thing to do for not just our residents, but for people who use the park, because we're open to the public. Okay, so you mentioned formalization of parking must not impact the tree roots, but our informal parking now does. So we're going to try to strike a balance there between, what are we doing now and how can we do better? And Dan Keyes made some good points about, how the trees are doing now. And so I'll be interested to hear more about that. Here's a specific question. Once you formalize the parking, let's say we went with one of your plans and, we broke ground. How do we keep cars from parking elsewhere? Or would we not do that? And right now, cars can park sort of wherever they can squeeze in. But if we formalize parking, would you recommend elements to keep people from parking in the places that are not designated, formalized as parking spaces? Yeah,
we can do raised curbs. We can landscape it. It depends on what level of intensity you want. The more improvements that you do, the more the more commercial it starts to look. And I think that one of the things that makes the park so beautiful right now is that it still has that community residential quality to it. So I would say that we would sort of look at a very strategic and surgical approach to how we sort of corral the parking. We could do tree guards, we could do all sorts of stuff. I think the critical piece is finding out first, what is that carrying capacity and what is that parking number so that we can best locate
That's what I wanted to hear, because I didn't see anything on there that kind of would make you not be able to park somewhere. And I wanted to know how hard those things could be, or if you could sort of soften them up. And that'll be an interesting part of the conversation when we do have it, because if we don't want people to park there for some reason, we need to make sure they cannot, I guess.
Correct. The Commissioner, if I may, one of the challenges that we do have with regards to putting in raised curbs is that it may start to impact the drainage pattern. And the last thing that we want to do is put a raised curb around all the areas that are not parking, because then we're funneling all the drainage into those areas that are paved, and then we may just simply see flooding. So I think it's something that we have to be very cautious about.
Okay. I was happy to hear so many people bring up 9th Avenue possibly going one way. And it was interesting that Bob Anderson mentioned that it sort of seemed to be a plan at one point. I don't have an opinion on it, certainly not tonight anyway. But I'm anxious to learn more about that, because it's kind of an iffy street to drive down sometimes, I have to say. It's tight in there anyway. I was just driving there tonight to count the cars on the way here, and I did a loop all the way, I did 2 loops around it actually. And it's just, when there are a lot of cars parked there, it's a very tricky street to navigate with traffic going both directions.
Now, I will tell you that I'm looking at my notes, and the width that we documented for 9th Court is 16 feet. And the width that we documented for 9th Avenue is 20 feet. So
It's only 4 feet wider.
Right. And you're really at that really minimal travel lane width, which is 10 feet, which is the absolute minimum that the county would allow.
Gotcha. So
But being
you're
able to
saying that
turn
our
that into a
two-way
one-way-
street, you're saying our two-way street is not that significantly wider than our one-way street.
Correct. And that's probably by design, because again, the fire department is not going to allow you to
Right.
do a
Okay.
10-foot one way.
I'm glad some people mentioned back in parking, because I was trying to remember if I've ever backed into a parking space and I can't recall. I could now with a camera in the back of my car, but I would hate to be on the sidewalk while some people are trying to back in. Speaking of, how do we better protect pedestrians and people using the facilities, kids especially, from the parked cars? Because right now it seems like would you be recommending ways to stop the cars from being able to access the sidewalk? Because right now, some places it's wide open and it feels very dangerous to me, and there's kids running around sometimes.
Yeah, I think that the most cost-effective way of doing that in a way that doesn't negatively impact and block your drainage is to simply just use wheel stops, which you buy those prefabricated and sort of drill those into the ground. And if they crack, you just pull them out and replace them. That's the best way to do that. Again, if we curb the parking areas to put a barrier between pedestrians and the cars, then we start to impact
That's drainage then.
drainage. Correct.
So
Vice Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt. When looking at moving the sidewalk to the interior of the park, there is plenty of room throughout the park to be able to do that, especially and to accommodate that parking. It doesn't necessarily have to be right up against where the trees are.
Mhm.
Because we have sufficient inside footage, we could move that sidewalk further back, especially over facing further into the park, correct? Especially that side facing the east or 9th Court. If we were to flip that sidewalk to the interior of the park, we can be further enough away from the trees so that we have the maximum protection there. And that also protects the pedestrians that do those loops and walk around, because now they're walking more in the interior. We do lose footage, right, for programming, but that is an option that we can definitely be looking at to be able to do that. And that opens up not only for parking, but also space in between where we can do. I do like the idea around the trees. If an idea is to, hey, we can put tree guards around the trees, which many municipalities, especially when you go further up north, they do that. We can even try to tie in some of the log cabin and the historical nature. Instead of just using a wood plank or metal or some type of fencing, you can try to get something that's more like logs, right? To be able to carry that theme out. Or you can plant more of shrubbery, and I'll leave that to the Parks and Parkway and our arborist and our landscape architect, Giano. But in my mind, I can see shrubbery around that would then corner off the various, groups of parking spaces that we have. And you don't need to have 64, right? If we say, hey, we're going to want, let's try to look between 40 to 50 spots, and let's try to push that onto the ninth Court and 9th Avenue area, then we can start redesigning or taking a look at some of that, so that we can start saying, okay, this is how we can start accommodating, and this is what the impact and then what the actual project might even look like. So there's a lot of options that we have available to us.
I have a couple of quick things here. So, Giano, I don't know if bollard is the right word. Those wooden posts that are out
Correct.
there now.
I was just going to bring it up. I was going to say that keeping in line with what you already have, you could also put bollards in between the walkway and the parking to prevent a car from moving in. The only problem is that then you have to get them really close together, roughly around 6 feet on center, so the car doesn't squeeze in between, and it starts looking really cluttered.
Got it. Okay. And those are there to keep, are those there now to keep cars from accessing the field? Is that what they're there for?
I think they're there now more as a delineation between the parking and the pedestrian as a visual cue, but in the areas that they do exist, they're roughly about 8 to 10 feet apart. So if you really wanted to drive a car in between them, you could at times.
Okay. And then my last question is about drainage. So you discussed different kinds of parking surfaces, and it was interesting to hear about the pervious asphalt. The pervious pavers and the asphalt, how do they compare generally speaking, in the amount of water that they allow to go down versus plain dirt?
The pervious asphalt actually performs really well. The answer, the pervious asphalt works a whole lot better at allowing water to percolate vis-a-vis a pervious paver. But the system, how far down you excavate, how much rock you put, is all being driven of the volume of water that you have to be able to accommodate. When you have bare sand areas that have been compacted, sometimes that compaction minimizes the perviousness of the natural soil. And that's why sometimes you might see some of your soils remain a little bit wetter after a sort of heavy rain event, longer than other areas, maybe because of the compaction. But in order to really ascertain what your existing conditions are, that will require a soil analysis done by a geotechnical engineer to really understand, one, what is the soil makeup, two, what is its carrying capacity, and make sure that there's enough of a percolation rate that it can accommodate passive drainage.
Wonderful. I just thought of one more thing I want to ask you real quickly. Regarding the sidewalks, something that did not come up is the condition of the sidewalks now. So we're talking about the possibility that sidewalks might get moved to accommodate parking or whatever. Are any of our sidewalks in bad enough shape that they should be replaced anyway? Some of them are sticking up. I think Public Works has gone in and painted red stripes on them so people see them and they don't trip. Are we at the point where they're going to be in enough disrepair that something would need to be done anyway?
I mean, we looked specifically at the parking arrangement, but I will tell you this: if you are going to do the parking improvements, it's worthwhile considering doing the replacement of the sidewalks. But that's a budgetary consideration that you need to take as a commission in terms of when can you sort of plan the money for your capital improvement to replace that. Definitely, if the sidewalks, and some of the sidewalks are really close to the tree trunks, those sidewalks particularly are the ones that are seeing the most damage by tree roots. But because of their close proximity to the tree trunks, we wouldn't recommend doing a root barrier there because the herbicide on the root barrier could potentially impact the tree.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to go on a different route. I'm not an arborist, nor am I a parking expert, but I am extremely practical. And I have looked and studied this whole area on my level. I see nothing wrong with the parking that's going on except on 9th Court. That is a problem. The whole street is a problem. It is nowhere near one of our worst streets. But if we're going to do work, we've got a limited budget. I would like to see 9th Court redone and do the street also. Just do what's necessary for the handicap parking, redo all that, but do the street. Instead of doing parking around the rest of the park, we don't really need it. I don't know that the trees don't look terrible to me. I don't know what damage we're doing because I don't see it. So they're parking on the ground, that's okay. And I'd really just like to see the money spent on one street. It's a start. We have a lot of areas to go, but that's a start to do that. Thank you.
9th Court, do you mean 9th Avenue?
Right,
You mean 9th Avenue? You said 9th Court.
right.
You mean 9th Avenue, okay.
The one-way street. The one-way street.
So you do mean 9th Court?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, that's the bad area. That's where we need the most work. The handicap, you can't even walk there. And if we did that whole street, that would be a start. And that would be our $50,000 budget probably to start. The other is beautiful and it would be really nice when we get wealthy. But I don't think the village is wealthy yet. Thank you.
Yeah, go right ahead.
With regard to, moving the sidewalk in, there was a situation during one of our previous managers' administrations where there was some damage to the sidewalk around one of the trees, adjacent to one of the trees. And I was lucky enough to have a conversation with the manager and suggested to her that she move a section of sidewalk into the park. And that's why you have the little jog on 9th Avenue. There's a jog in that sidewalk, goes in one direction and jogs over. She was going to replace the sidewalk in the same place, the sidewalk that had just been damaged by the tree's proximity. I told her, move it in, and it works fine. And anytime we're gonna take a look at moving the sidewalk in, we before all that's done, we have to superimpose soccer fields, baseball fields, and football fields onto the grassy area of the field. Okay, and not only the football fields or the soccer fields, but the required pedestrian separation zone that at one time was required as well. Okay, just so that you don't by 2 feet hinder our ability to utilize the field someday in the future when all of us are dead and gone, when somebody wants to have sports programs there again. So that's very important. It's very easy to do. Somebody in the recreation department is going to have to contact some other bigger organizations and see what their league requirements are for those fields and pedestrian zones adjacent to the field. You're not going to have the room, in my opinion, north to south to put the sidewalk inside the bollards that are there. It is right at the absolute limits of a football field with 2 end zones, where there's a telephone pole on the north end and and you run out of room on the other end. So that one probably, the one on 113th Street probably cannot be moved in. The easiest to do is the one on 9th Avenue. Harder to do is the one on 9th Court because you have the baseball backstop fencing that hinders where you can put a football field. Because even now, as they had constructed that new backstop, some of that would have to be removed if you ever did go to a football or soccer program. And you know, I know that we're concerned about drainage and so forth, but consider the fact that you have 5 acres of grass adjacent to those areas. Okay, figure out how to get the water into that grass, and I don't think you're going to have a drainage problem. I personally am against the idea of one-waying 9th Avenue. I think that's more of a throughway. 9th Court was a T street on one end. You don't have through traffic one end of the village to the other. I don't think it's gonna fly with people who have to agree with that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have Janie Anderson on Zoom. And okay, thank you, Mrs. Koo. Janie?
Thank you. Janie Anderson, 11th Place and 119th Street. Just a reminder, our parking situation as it currently exists at the rec center, in fact, does not adhere to our code. Because we're not talking once in a great while, like on an individual resident may have a party and once in a while people are parked on an unapproved surface. We're talking about something pretty regular. So I think if we're going to be enforcing our code on individual residents, we need to lead the way. Now, that being said, having lived here over 43 years, I am well acquainted with our financial situation, but any good capital project, you make the commitment, you break it out over a period of time. Nobody is expecting this to be done in a year or two. It gets done as it can. But we need to get out of the mindset of being penny wise and pound foolish and sort of keeping things together with bubblegum rubber bands and a little duct tape and make that long-term commitment. You budget X number of thousand each year, you get it done. But bring our public buildings up to code. If it's not okay for an individual resident to have a chewed up gravel rock pit as a parking space, it's not okay for the city. Thanks.
Thank you.
I agree with Janie that years ago we were trying to get the parking areas improved because it was dirt and rock. And even if we put gravel down, we need to conform to our codes. Otherwise, we can't ask residents. And she's right, there's stages to do this, but I don't think we should just stick with one street. I think we can afford to do more. And about moving the sidewalks inside, I agree with what Dan was saying, but the other thing is right now you're walking with a sidewalk and you have bollards separating you from the playing field. And many times there are very active soccer games going on. I wouldn't want to be walking and expect somebody to trample me. So I think you do need a separation. Years ago on Park and Parkways, we had a landscape architect that laid out the field, marked it so that we wouldn't plant trees where that would interfere with the possible soccer field, football, just so we would know where everything is. And I think you have to be very careful not to do anything that would jeopardize having that, because like Dan said, you never know, you want to plan for 10 years in the future. The other thing about handicap, I think it's a great idea to have handicap done at the other side to get to the tot lot, the playing area, except we don't have any handicap any access. So I think if you're going to put a handicap space there, you're going to have to include a sidewalk, which I think if you want to be handicap friendly, you should have a sidewalk going to the children's thing from either end. You don't have that. Thank you. Just one other thing. I actually don't agree with Gary with the one way on 9th Avenue. You know, I think you really need to ask the community, not just people living right on that street, because I don't live on that street, but I drive on that street a lot. And I don't want to have to go weaving in and out, crisscrossing. You can have somebody else getting more traffic because now they can't go through. So it's a commitment. And this 9th Court was a much shorter distance that people weren't using that as a main thoroughfare. Thanks.
Thank you.
When I put the bollards in around the park in 1976, 7 thereabouts, they were put on 6-foot centers. They were installed because we had people going on the field doing donuts on the field. So, and so I don't believe in some have been moved over the years here and there or reinstalled, but they're about 6 foot apart and they should stop a car.
Thank you. Bob Anderson wanted to ask or make another comment.
Yes, I'm using the right computer now, hopefully. That, you know, as it was brought up about doing phases that Jenny Anderson brought up, that's the way the sidewalks were put in. Those sidewalks, we were talking about for having sidewalks put in around the park for almost since we've moved here. And it was always, we can't afford to do it. Then we happen to have one of our managers that said, yes, we can. Let's just do it in phases. And over a number of years, all of a sudden we had sidewalks put in around the park. One of the things as far as the sidewalks lifting around the trees, obviously, you know, because of tree roots, why don't we go ahead, like I've seen in some other cities, don't actually have straight sidewalks. Have them, you know, when they get to an area that it's going to infringe upon vegetation, have a turn and serpentine. It looks nicer. It gives a little bit more of an interesting walkway, or if you happen to be jogging, you know, around the area. But I think we can really, really do that. And part of the one-way that was discussed many, many years ago, besides having less traffic on each side of the park, 9th, people had always been complained about as being a throughway during rush hour traffic in the morning or in the evening. I mean, there's many other streets people complain about the same thing. This was an easy way to discourage people using this as a throughway. And also, it makes it a little bit easier. It's a recreation center. When you're walking out from the recreation center, it's a lot easier to look only one way than two-way for traffic coming through. In 9th Avenue over there, if you drive down it, you can see what the tree roots have been doing to that roadway. So something's going to need to be done one way or the other, or go ahead and take the parts where the road is being torn up with the tree roots and maybe let the tree roots breathe a little bit and open up some of that so you have parking in between the trees. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to throw a quick question out to the group. I know all of our sidewalks are typical sidewalks. They're concrete. Could there be an appetite to change that to match potentially the pervious asphalt instead? With a concrete sidewalk, you usually have to take out that from the edge of the slab, which are about 5 feet, 6 feet. Where with an asphalt, you might be able to contain if you got to do any maintenance to that. But again, when it starts raining, instead of it just pulling on the sidewalk, you have that pervious. It could look more like a track around, make it a little bit easier. Just a thought that we can maybe think about. And we'll have that flexibility a little bit easier to move that and like Bob was just recommending, even snake that through the community. So it's just a thought for us to think of. If we're going to have to redo everything, how would that play into, and I know Miami Lakes, even on some of their trails, they just were awarded a grant from the Miami Foundation where they applied a type of material on their asphalt where at night that asphalt has somewhat of a dim feature, like a lighting feature on the asphalt itself. So there's other creative things we can also do. And I think they created it in somewhat of an artistic design towards it. And I can try to find some pictures and video to kind of show what that would look like. But we do have some opportunity to be a little bit creative there that might make it a little bit easier for maintenance as well, if we do have to move it around. Is there any other questions or comments?
One other thing I want to say, well, and just to dovetail on what you just said, Mario, if we do touch the sidewalks, it's also an opportunity to address the width of them, possibly make them wider as well. I have a
Correct.
question for Gianna regarding ADA parking, because this is in my mind and I'm thinking a lot about access for everybody to our facility. Can handicap spaces, and I know I'm not even using the right terminology, so I apologize for that, but can handicap spaces be used in parallel parking situations, or do they have to be pull in?
They operate better when they're pull-in parking, either angled or perpendicular.
But they can be used for parallel. A parallel parking space can be legally used?
There are situations where in an urban condition, they have arrangements that are acceptable, but frankly, if an able person who is, if a disabled person who has some level of mobility is able to dismount the vehicle, you really don't want them to be dismounting right next to a travel lane. And that's the problem with the parallel parking. It's best to have it perpendicular so that you can have that dismount area right next to the parking space that really gives them a certain level of safety.
Okay, understood. That's what I wanted to hear as we start in the future, think about the possibility of adding more. I just wanted to understand what all the options might be. I think Judy wants to say something.
Yeah, if you're loading and unloading a wheelchair in and out of the traffic lane, it's a nightmare.
Yeah,
So
it
we don't generally recommend it. It's usually at least angle.
And I was going to mention earlier that if we are looking at adding handicap parking, then that should preclude us to only do angled or pull-in parking, not parallel in those situations.
Okay, so I think that takes into account quite a bit of information that we'll have to get back with Calvin Giordano and take a look, verify the field dimensions like we mentioned, to see what options are available with Sidewalk, which can help determine some of that parking. Also, it sounds like although there might be appetite to increase parking, definitely not go to the 64 route. So in order to kind of narrow that field down, we'll end up talking to see what kind of more of a formalized survey we can do, and then bring back more of a formal recommendation to the commission so that we can have a little bit more direction as to, okay, we can narrow down, maybe after the survey of the parking, we're talking about 30 spaces, not 53. Maybe we are hitting that 53. Maybe, once we have a little bit more direction on that, then we can talk about whether it's angled. I think there's going to be, overall, from the sentiment I've gotten, it's probably going to be a little bit more of a hybrid, depending on the areas throughout the park and what that kind of looks like and where the numbers. But it does sound we want to maximize the protection of the trees, which has always been the primary focus. So, yes.
Just to remind you, there was one resident who emailed in a comment that she asked to be read onto record this evening.
Okay.
I have it in front of me if you want me to give it to you.
If you already have it, if you can just read it into the record.
The email is from Catherine Anise. I'm mispronouncing your name, Catherine. Apologies for that, Anise. And she emailed, "Hello, I'm a resident and would like the following to be read Thursday at the town hall discussion for the Park and Rec master parking plan on 12/16/21. Unfortunately, I'm unable to attend and only able to watch the meeting afterwards, but I would like to give my input and opinion towards the discussion. Thank you." And the names are Catherine Anise and Carlos Capo, 11149 Northeast 8th Avenue. As a resident who walks laps almost daily around the park, I strongly believe our park needs a revamp for the parking. The reasons being aesthetics, but mostly for the pollution. Our park is the only area of the village with a sidewalk where we can avoid the constant interruptions from cars and the pollution they emit. But often I find even this to be untrue. I frequently encounter idling cars and exhaust fumes as cars pull in and out while I'm walking. I would love to see the parking spaces limited to no more than 2 designated areas rather than the entire perimeter of the park. I would also like to see head-in parking only and to remove parallel parking. Removing parallel parking would allow for exhaust from cars to go towards the road rather than the sidewalk, and it would prevent car doors from being open over the sidewalk area, a problem we have now. Car doors opening over the sidewalk also creates a hazard to anyone not paying attention. I think the designated parking areas should also be away from where groups of people congregate, an example being the tot lot. I personally think cars currently idle too closely to where young children are playing. It would probably be best to have the designated parking areas a little farther away. Overall, I think by limiting the number of parking areas and having head-in parking, we can create more green space and easier breathing for everyone.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Thank you for everybody who's joined us tonight. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. And I do enjoy having people in here in person. If anybody has any further questions or comments, feel free to send us an email. My email address is villagemanager@biscayneparkfl.gov. And we can always forward that even to either Calvin Giordano for any input, or if you just want to comment as well, we'll always continue to take that. As soon as we are able to kind of reorganize and figure out the next steps and how that's going to move forward, we'll continue to update the community and the commission, and we'll bring it back. In case I don't see you, have a wonderful, happy holidays and a happy new year. And we'll come back to you next year. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.